Welcome everyone again, wherever you might be tuning in for, to our monthly edition. This is the third month that we've done it, the new Operations Normal. Delighted to add to the panel this week with MArcel Altenburg, who's the Senior Lecturer, Program Leader, Crowd Science at Manchester Metropolitan University. Someone who told me a couple of days ago that he hasn't had a day off since COVID started, and I tend to believe that with a combination of the work about and his passion. Great to see you, MArcel. Mike Nishi from Chicago, event management, event partner there. Thank you, Mike. Welcome. And Hugh Singe, Managing Director, Event Health Management and Medical Director of the Standard Chartered Singapore Marathon, joining us from Perth. Welcome again. And excited to have, I think, as I say, the third edition of this with lots. There's been such a flurry of activity we were discussing before of what's happened over the last few days. So yeah, lots to share, lots of new information. I'm just going to, as I always do, just pop a poll in just to get a sense of what industry sector we have joining us. If you'd like to put that on while I go through with just a little bit of housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute. I have both the chat and the Q&A box up, so please feel free to put any comments in there as we go through, and I'll do my best to respond to questions and so on as we go through. We are live on Facebook and also recording, and will be uploaded to the Mass Participation World YouTube channel. So if any of your colleagues miss this or you have to jump off before it's over, please feel free to jump on and catch it on either of those. Very quick mention, as always, of some of the other initiatives. A new one which will be announced formally early next week, but I'm looking to hold a Mass Participation World Online Summit in the first week of September. I'm going to be sending out a survey early next week, and we would really value, firstly, you registering your interest if you think that that's something you'd want to be a part of. And also, we would love to have some insights. There's going to be questions on the program, question on whether you want it to be 2 half days, 4 days of 2 hours, and so on. So would really value the industry feedback so that we can curate that program to best benefit everyone. Strength in Numbers every Monday at 4:30 p.m., which is just a gathering in Zoom where we get together with, we have a bunch of regulars that come in there, and everyone welcome to come and join just to chat about what might be going on. The Aid Station, my interviews, we had our 50th edition last Friday. We had MArcel on 2 days ago, and today we had a wonderful interview with John Ridgen, the CEO of World Athletics. So catch those, about 15-20 minutes of great insights from all over the world. And then I've got a really exciting masterclass next week, which is going to be talking about sponsorship post-COVID. Have an amazing panel. Giles Morgan, former global head of sponsorship for HSBC. Michelle Taylor, the global head of sports sponsorship for TCS based out in New York. James Robinson from Limelight, ex-IMG, and Matt Rogan from Two Circles. Those of you that were at Mass Participation World would have seen Matt's fantastic presentation, lots of research insights and so on. So that's next week. I'm just going to end that poll and pop the results in there. Yeah, just finally, if you've got any questions at any stage, please feel free to reach out to me directly, chris@chrisrobb.asia. Connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook to get the details of all these things that happen. And then, I guess, moving forward, as always, probably 5 key areas that we're going to look to try and touch on today. We're going to start by looking at some of these major announcements that have happened, and some of those are obviously events. There's some good news out of Hamburg, but some less good news out of other areas. We're going to touch on some of the things that have been happening around the world. Hugh's going to give us some update in terms of what's happening in the medical sense, in terms of any new tests and guidelines and things that have come through. We're going to touch on participants, which is a bit of a follow-up. Mike shared last week that around participants there were 3 potential tsunamis, and one of those tsunamis was the announcement of a cancellation of an event. And hopefully we're not going to be prophetic this week, but the day after our call last month, Boston unfortunately announced their cancellation. Hopefully there's nothing coming tomorrow, Mike, but we'll talk about the impact on participants. We're going to a whole bunch of stuff around operations, which is obviously one of the key elements of this. And then we'll touch on budgets, and again, I think that's a little bit of a moving feast. But I think moving back to the kind of major announcements, This week, there's been quite a lot of mixed news. We had Hamburg saying that they look like they're going to be on, and then, not long after that, New York announcing that they were cancelling, Berlin formalizing that they were cancelling, Great North last week cancelling, and the same week London saying that we're still hopeful that we're going to be working towards a solution. We had the World Athletics outbreak prevention guides released, and there's a tool on their website which people can use. We had New Zealand opening up with, 2 weeks ago, packed stadiums of 43,000 people watching rugby. Some developments in Australia, which Hugh might be able to share. We had the Spartan event in Florida with 1,400 participants. So some things happening, some things not happening. Why don't we throw over to you, Mike, just to get some of your take on that and some of the impact that some of those announcements might have had on you in Chicago at this stage.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone, or evening, depending on where you're from. I think the news that came out from New York, not shocking, since I think everyone understands the reality in terms of where we live and the real, being realistic about the risk and future outlook for our size events. But it still did trigger a lot of commotion in the industry, especially for other large events or marathons that, haven't confirmed, whether we're going to be able to hold the event or not. So for example, like Chicago. So we're still, in a holding pattern, working, as you know, and I've communicated here as well, in terms of hosting event or, looking at different options if we had to cancel. So, it's been difficult for us. And that was one of the tsunamis as the example that I used, is if one of another major marathon canceled, that just starts to trigger a chain reaction and a lot of questions in our industry, as well as our stakeholders, partners, and participants. So as you alluded to, Chris, Boston canceled, and obviously that created a ripple effect. And now with Berlin officially announcing, as well as New York on the same day on Wednesday, obviously those waves are getting bigger and the ripples getting much stronger. So, as of the communication yesterday, which we knew that, there are things that similar to us that were going down those paths. So it wasn't absolutely shocking. But I think because of that ripple, it has created a lot of questions to us, or from local media reaching out to us for statements in terms of what our realistic outlook is for our event and our event status. And those calls were also received by the city of Chicago. So if you could imagine, once they start getting those questions, a lot of internal conversations start to take place between our organization and the city, which isn't always bad, which is getting a lot of people's attention in terms of what's happening in this space. So it's been a very interesting week, and in addition to the Abbott World Marathon Majors making significant announcements last week and yesterday, on Tuesday we also had another announcement of Twin Cities and Minneapolis canceled, and that's a Midwest event, would have taken place the weekend before. So that's another one that really impacts and getting closer to Chicago, an annual fall event that is always around the same time and very popular with a lot of the runners and domestically and some international. So those announcements are making a lot of noise in the atmosphere around us. So now we're starting to get a lot more activity. As we talked about, those other waves coming and towards us are decisions that need to be made by individuals as training programs are progressing, the miles getting longer, people investing time and resources. And then, as well as we know, once July starts to hit, additional commitments will need to be made, whether it's by some of our partners, but also specifically to the participants when it comes to travel and housing or air travel. So, once people start to have to commit dollars, then there's going to be additional questions. So, we have these a lot of activity now coming from the customer service standpoint. Now we're having a lot more questions, and everything around us impacting that has definitely increased the amount of questions we're getting, the amount of calls that we're receiving, a lot of additional activity on social media around that now.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it must be massively challenging times for you with all that additional pressure. Hugh, interesting times in Australia, and I know you've been integrally involved in that. Quite a lot of good news. Victoria around Melbourne took a bit of a step back, where West Australia, where you are, seems to have been opening up. Maybe just some insights into that, and what it might mean for the broader audience, given that we've got such a bigger audience on here from all over the world.
Yeah, it is really a mixed bag at the moment, Chris, as you've just alluded to. There's so much now around the world. We're looking at a full spectrum of scenarios. There are some jurisdictions in the world that in recent weeks have had some publicity around being able to lift measures to the point where we're starting to see crowds with some restrictions get together, and we're starting to see some crowds with no restrictions get together. And then we see the other end of the scale, where we're seeing some states in the United States seeing risk of flare-ups. There are some countries throughout Asia that are starting to go through a second wave sort of hit of the virus. So there's a really big mix now in terms of the impact on mass gatherings. Certainly where I am in Australia at the moment is a really big talking point across the industry, across the world. New Zealand very publicly a couple of weeks ago started sport again. Auckland has a stadium, Eden Park. Rugby fans from around the world are all very well aware of what Eden Park is and what it means to the Kiwis. They filled it out with 43,000 people only 2 weeks ago. We see now some parts of Australia are about to follow suit this week, starting to lift measures. And in essence, in Western Australia, where I am at the moment, we're expecting to see 60,000 people at professional football games in just over 3 weeks' time. That's vastly different to other states in Australia where only this week they've recommenced shutting the state down again. The military was brought into one particular state around Melbourne. So the state of Victoria has now got the Australian Defence Force involved to support local health agencies. It's at great risk of flaring up. And as we've seen all around the world, no matter where you are, one small flare up really comes back with a fairly hard bite on all of this. And hence, I think everyone in this forum has such an interest in the topic. We all know that a small number becomes big really quickly, and it's a really scary prospect for everyone. So on the positive, before we get to the end of the tunnel with the light that we want to get to, we have to go through these stages. And part of it is understanding where we're comfortable. And as we come out of restrictions and lift them, we will see flare-ups, we'll see localized outbreaks. And to have confidence in isolating those outbreaks is really important part for this industry. When we saw initial flare-ups in so many countries around February and March, so much wasn't known about the virus. We didn't have as many testing kits available around the world. The World Health Organization was learning very quickly around what it was dealing with. We're now in a position where the world has better resources, better testing capabilities, better technologies contributed to that. We've got a far better understanding of the properties of the virus. The resources have been better placed around the world. And that's not saying for a second that we're on top of this, because clearly we're not. We're very scary this week. We're infecting the world at a rate of more than 1 million people a week, which is a horrific stat, and it's not going to change anytime soon. However, we are starting to see in this space a really big difference in conversation in some parts of the world who are now enjoying crowds for 2 weeks with no restrictions. There are some parts of the world that are starting to enjoy crowds with some restrictions, and there are some parts of the world where a crowd just is unforeseeable for probably the rest of this year unless something changes. So it's been a really big difference in where we were sitting probably a month or so ago. And the world is watching some jurisdictions very much, like New Zealand was probably the highest publicised one because it brings crowds in. We did see 8 countries effectively eliminate the virus before New Zealand got there. But New Zealand was the first one to go back on the international stage with large numbers of people getting together. So it's gauged a lot of interest from people around the world. Clearly in the last month, there's a lot of questions being asked around broader medical developments. Testing is one that we've spoken about a couple of times. Testing is so important to us moving forward to our new normality at the end of this, testing and isolating is something we've heard time and time again. It's incredibly important. And that testing capacity is going to make a really big difference for us. However, it doesn't in itself give us the ability to put mass gatherings and mass participation events together. It takes a lot more than that. And everyone in this forum is well aware of that. So I don't have anything, I always avoid the topic of silver bullet and always hesitate to talk about silver bullets, other than to point out there isn't one. But at this point in the game, we've now got several months for most people of forecasting, prediction, and trying to have an outlook of what does the second half of this year look like for me? What does it look like for my event? What does it look like for my team? What does the beginning of next year look like? Because we are starting to ask those questions. As Mike said, New York was in a situation where it had to cancel this time yesterday. Berlin formally cancelled its race. Previously, it had to announce that it couldn't hold it on the dates that it would have been scheduled. So, while not surprising, when we look at where New York is placed in the first week of November, we are talking about a major event that's 12 months on from where we saw the first outbreak of the virus. So when we look at forecasting to say, what does it mean to my event in the second half of 2020, we're probably starting to see people in the first quarter of next year who were impacted by it this year and are starting to look at it with New York's announcement saying, well, if New York's cancelled in November, I'm only 2 or 3 months behind New York. How can I possibly face the second one? So I'm very cautious around talking around timeline, because we are in a space where, while everyone's following very carefully and probably understands now that a vaccine, if we find one, is a long window, and that antiviral treatments equally take a while, we're also in a very dangerous space where, while there's information going out through media, there is also a degree of skepticism that we have to take when we read anything through the media around vaccines and potential treatments, and mainly being that research institutions who put together, who partner up and put a lot of time and effort into developing vaccines, also rely on funding. So it's very hard sometimes to distinguish between those that are well ahead to those who are not as far ahead based on public announcements, because at the end of the day, it requires a lot of money and significant investment to be able to develop a vaccine to its endpoint. And clearly, the entire globe is pursuing this faster than we've ever seen. So it's very hard at this point in time to distinguish between those that are going to go the distance and still be there on the scene in a few months, those that are putting out favourable information and are seeking funding to keep pushing, to keep up with the rat race so they don't fall behind. It's a challenging world. So in that sense, the reason I mention it is I caution everybody when they're making decisions at the moment, over the coming months, as we start to get closer towards that. Everyone said it was a 12-month timeline. As we get closer towards that timeline, that everyone acts with a bit of caution and not to make decisions on the basis that, well, we think we're going to see a vaccine definitely by the end of this year, or this is really positive. It's not trying to dampen enthusiasm. I think it's just being responsible and understanding the dynamics behind some of these announcements. So at this stage, there's probably no major developments that we can all start to see where we're going to land with a time frame. But with a long-winded answer, it's the only way of cautioning people over a very dangerous phase when you're making commercial decision-making in the months ahead.
Yeah, great point. And you know, MArcel made the same thing before we came on air. It's, you know, it's like the virus doesn't respect the calendar year, and because we flip over to January doesn't mean that we're all back to square one again. Why don't we throw to you, MArcel? You've been involved in so many different things. You know, working with Bundesliga, working with the EPL, working with the likes of Mike and other majors, and obviously, as I understand it, you're working with the Hamburg guys as well. That was one piece of good news. Any kind of insights from that experience that you'd like to share, please?
You mentioned in the beginning the whole list of events that had announcements this week. Some said they won't go ahead. Some others finally said it won't happen. Hamburg said they have a plan which they put forward to the city. And I mean, you texted me saying that's quite a roller coaster of emotions, and I see it the same way, while it's at the same time important to keep the emotions out of this whole thing. And this shouldn't be seen as mixed messaging. This shouldn't be seen as one race is doing something, another event is not daring to do. That's not the point. They all basically see it themselves as individual races, something you should always do. You should never say, let's cancel everything or let's allow everything. That won't happen. But you need to assess it all very granularly, very individually. And we know the whole list that you mentioned before. We have good relations to them. When I talk about Hamburg, well, first of all, I got on this panel before I knew that the news would break this prominently, but everybody can Google it. To Hamburg, from my perspective, they hit a bit of a sweet spot, quite a major sweet spot of having a marathon distance race. Only, let's say, only 10,000 participants, and they have a big exhibition grounds with multiple exhibition halls where they can separate them down to 500 people, 1,000 people per individual hall, in order to try to, one newspaper said, the salami marathon. So try to salami it over 2 hours on the course and try to keep an overview and control over those 500 to 1,000 people individually. It is one of the most creative aspects that I've seen, and one of the most fortunate environments that they're operating in. So it makes sense for them. It made sense for them. Together with the city, they agreed to put this forward, to try a concept. The final decision will be made end of July. We are only looking at a very granular aspect of this, a very tiny aspect. I don't know what's right or wrong. I can tell them if they can put up this show as planned on the course, and in the finish it would be safe. But that there's so many things to it. Mike said it, operationally, you need to control it, because you're not controlling a crowd here, you're controlling individuals. Crowds are not the thing right now. You need to control everything individual, and they all need to listen and adhere. Same what you said. If a week before there is a flare up in Hamburg or in any small region of 50,000 people in Germany, what does it mean? Can those people not travel to Hamburg, or can they then not travel home? Like, those are some questions that need to be answered, and they can come a week before your event, and you will touch budget later. But there's just so much to it that can jeopardize your event. And if I can give you one example from the Football Bundesliga, where we are working in a similar environment. It's one country, it's one league, similar format of 90 minutes and the ball. But some stadia have working concepts to bring in a 5-digit number when the time is right, which would be safe and adhering to the rules. Some other venues, 100 kilometers away, that's roughly 60 miles for the Americans, they can't, zero, none. Not because it's unfair anyway, but because it was a individual assessment where they started with a blank piece of paper. And they just came to the conclusions, like, under COVID, the balance is so far thrown off, we can't look at it, while others would be the ones going first. And in the marathon world, Hamburg made this first move. Nobody knows if they will run. Everybody can look at this concept. It's publicly available, but at least my personal opinion is, if they're going so far of like publishing a concept, they should get all the support they can get to make the right decision from everybody basically in this forum, because they carry so much responsibility for their runners, but also for the industry. And the decision is not yet made. That's the important thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, is that, the decision's not made. Anything could happen, and I think that, highlights the commercial risk that everyone is under. Is you think you've got the green light, and a week before it disappears, and all of a sudden you've got all those sunk costs and all the other issues. It's the tightrope that everyone's walking at the moment. I'm interested, maybe Mike, if we can come back to you. Thanks for that, Marcel. The Spartan race. I've seen bits and pieces of that online. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it seems to have been successful. Obviously, the point that's been made a number of times is not commercially sustainable. And, you know, from an industry perspective, I guess in some ways we're lucky that there's a big organization like Spartan that's able to take some baby steps. And, you know, there's huge responsibilities across the industry. But any kind of key learnings that you picked up that came out of that event that took place in Florida?
Yeah, I think you know, Chris, I think it's great to see whether it's Hamburg or, you know, Spartan, to be able to take these practices and those plans and execute them, right? I think we're all watching, we're all going to learn, and especially from the Spartan standpoint, which is a lot smaller than what Hamburg is planning. But I really feel that, you know, we're taking a look at a lot of the logistics and the operations plan that went into it. I don't think, like you said, the outcome was what they were expecting or anticipating. And I think that's the other part, is as much as we want to build something, it's a matter of will they come. And so I think you're seeing that across the board, whether in the U.S., the political, you know, rally, and, you know, there was high hopes with mass gatherings, and that wasn't the case. And despite the sentiment that you might hear from the athletes, from our, you know, constituents, might reflect one thing, but in actuality, in terms of conning them then to show up from a financial model, from a commercially viable model, you know, we need to be careful as well. It's, you know, these plans look great on paper. Everything looks great when you run the numbers, but if people don't show up or can't show up, you know, that does have a significant and very significant impact to the event. So I think that was one of the things that we looked at as well, is what that outcome was. I think operationally they did a great job. I think there's a lot of things that I'm sure that they're going to take away from an after action report, that they'll have findings and be able to improve it as well. And I think it's a similar approach that you've seen in NASCAR with, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, they had an event, was with fans, but relatively small. Then the following, on Father's Day, with Talladega, they increased that number so they could test and improve their practices and how they implemented it. So I think Spartan was a good example in terms of starting small and continuing to improve or enhance what they've learned. So I think, you know, again, I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more detail coming out of Spartan, more after action reports, and seeing what their findings are. But it's a great opportunity to take a look at it. And, you know, I applaud those that take that first step. But to MArcel's point as well, I think, you know, we also need to be careful as event organizers, those that, you know, are pressured to make that first move, and understand what type of responsibility they have or impact, especially those that might not have put the planning into or done the work and planning when it comes to executing something this significant that could have a detrimental effect or a negative impact on their event, let alone our industry as well.
Yeah, and with that, maybe swing back to you, MArcel. So, you know, it's freely available, their plans. I had a message from someone today in Israel who spent all day on Google Translate trying to understand what the plans are. But, you know, are there any kind of key insights from that? You talked about it being called the Salami Marathon, but, you know, anything that you can share that would be valuable to the people here of some of the, you know, you said it's almost like, you know, a perfect environment with a marathon being able to spread out with a massive venue, with an expo. They've got kind of, you know, everything kind of weighing in their favor. But for people that are watching this, are there any innovative things that they did there that you think would be useful to share? Please.
Yeah, so first of all, regarding the sweet spot that they're in, they have a big city, which is Hamburg. They have a relatively small field of 10,000 runners, relatively small. And the trick that they have is basically breaking them down into 500 to 1,000 people, which is something that you can overlook if you need to control it. And they have a lot of space. So when we say this exhibition hall is full, we talk about something completely different than before. They can basically control them individually. If something would go wrong actually in one, so the 1.50 meter distance wouldn't be kept. So in that aspect, something went wrong there. You could still separate it from all the other halls. They don't even see each other. So a participant doesn't see more than 999 other runners actually at the start. On the course, even much less. So we measured all the way through, and they have on the course, they can keep up to 4 meters. 4 meters the minimum that they can keep on the course running, of course they need to choose that themselves, but we give enough resources in order to keep 4 meters apart, which is based on some of the innovations that came out of World Marathon Majors. Although we also understand that the World Marathon Major event would be something completely different. If you can compare this magnitude to New York, who canceled on the same day, there would be an 11-hour start window, just to like get an idea of the slicing salami, but also the size of the total salami. An 11-hour start window to get the same result on the course, not the finish. And that just shows how Hamburg is basically in somewhat of a sweet spot to go forward with a concept. They did the first step of putting it publicly out there with enough time before the decision that gives all of us the chance to look at those infographics, which are really good, or ask the questions or reach out to them to help them criticize it. Help ask the one question that maybe cancels the whole event. But they need to know the question before they see it on the day, and that's very important. And they've done the step to be so transparent, which informs all of us. And maybe it remains the first concept, but not the first race. But even then, we learned something. They will also definitely learn something about public perception and runners' perception. How do they react? Can they even get to those numbers? What are the questions that they come up with? All of those will be answers that are of interest for all of us. Although, as I just said, it won't be something that can be just copied by Chicago or Berlin or New York. It's just completely different magnitude of what they are trying. But the key aspect is breaking it down into individual races of 1,000 people max.
Yeah, that was interesting. I was on a call. I'm hosting a webinar tomorrow for the AMSI, Australian Mass Participation Sports Events Alliance, with Craig Sheridan and Wayne Larden, who's race director of Sydney Marathon, who you've been working with as well. And that was the kind of point he spoke about in terms of speaking points is, we market ourselves as a mass participation industry, but fundamentally their solution is similar to that. We're running these number of small races, and it means that Sydney Harbour Bridge will, assuming that they can get the go-ahead, will be potentially closed for an extra 2 hours. So that from a narrative perspective, it's an interesting one. It doesn't take away all the other challenges we've spoken about, but when you're speaking to your agencies and so on, I think I shared a couple of weeks ago, someone said to me that the biggest problem we've got is we call ourselves the mass participation industry. We should rename ourselves, and get away from it. The reality is we are, but when you're having those conversations in your individual jurisdictions, and this all is localized, we might have 10,000 participants, but we're running 10 races of 1,000 people or 10 races of 500. Mike, maybe just coming back to you, an interesting precedent here that, Hamburg Marathon, and you're one of the most sharing people in the industry in terms of, the knowledge you share, your plans and so on. But, here's a race that's fundamentally put out these massively detailed plans in terms of, stuff that would probably in the past be considered as IP that wouldn't be shared. And to get ourselves in the industry, I mean, it speaks hugely to the level of collaboration that's happening, but it's kind of almost wondering if this is kind of part of the new normal as we move forward, that races will be required to put their detailed operational plans out to keep the participants happy. Just any thoughts that you might have on that?
No, I think that's a great a step forward, and that type of transparency should be applauded. And like MArcel said, once you have a plan out there and try to get that feedback, and that's definitely one way to do it. Where a lot of the professionals in the industry, and you hate to be on the receiving end and everyone's shooting holes in it, but that's probably part of the plan to see where that weakness or additional gaps might be, and then the rest of the industry to be able to identify them and help with the mitigation strategy and those contingency plans. So I think with that type of transparency also comes with additional opportunity to gain feedback that you might not have, internally, that other people might be able to see. And again, I think there's other things by being able to provide a plan like that. And I think everyone's aware, if when we share those best practices, it's I think a great approach to help our industry move forward as well. If other events don't have these plans, that they can help implement the ones that are solid, that would work in a different market, different environment, might benefit that race. So if we continue that model, and I'm a firm believer in it. You share that information, it's going to help someone else. So I might not be able to implement it, but if that type of work and that type of plan can be effective somewhere else, it's a great way, one, to help our industry as a whole, that one event specifically, but also coming back with shared information to be able to help make those continual improvements and enhancements that are necessary in any plan. So, I think it's a great opportunity, for all of us, and especially for them to get that type of feedback from our industry experts.
Thanks, Mike. Folks, before I'm going to come back to you, Hugh, but I'm just wondering, we've all got challenges, we've all got problems, and I'd love you, if you feel game, to put your biggest challenges that you're facing in either the Q&A or the chat. We've got a couple of questions that I'm going to pick up in the chat, but I think it would, there's lots of people in the industry right now that undoubtedly and understandably are really struggling, and sometimes in these situations to see people put out, this is my problem, it might well be able to give someone an opportunity to help you, but it might also be able to give someone the opportunity to say, well, I'm not alone here. So fire away if you feel confident. And it also, to be honest, it's a little bit self-serving, because I'd love to look at topics for future webinars. So if you can tell us what your problems are, we can help you to hopefully solve those by bringing the right kind of panels together. So if you feel comfortable doing that as we go through, put them through. Why don't I just quickly pick up here a couple of comments, and then I'd love to come back to you, Hugh. Eric Cohn, large gatherings in Australia, are they requiring masks? So Hugh, I'll get you to answer that when I come back to you. You've spoken about Fargo Marathon. I think MArcel has already responded to that. Spartan said Spartan is scheduled on the same weekend late in August with the hope of seeing 10,000 as well. Reto, Hamburg Marathon concept looks like running naked, means no side events, no speakers, no motivation points, no emotions, wearing face masks, runners discussing controversial in social media. Half of them are happy to run, others are missing the atmosphere. Look, I think that's undoubtedly the challenge that the industry faces, and we have the option of a run without the frills or no run at all, and the consumers are going to decide. And I guess it's happening in many other industries as well. When you get on a plane, and have the risk of maybe sitting next to someone, whether they're wearing a face mask or you choose not to, the consumers are going to vote. But I guess as an industry, we're going to have to just be trying to address those and take these baby steps in every single one of them. And we're fortunate, as I said, with the Spartan model, that we've got people like Spartan who are able to give us some case studies. My sense is it doesn't matter who's first. It doesn't matter where they are in the world. The only hope is that they're being successful and not unsuccessful and attracting a whole bunch of negative media. But the more case studies we have to be able to take that information and then localize it, which is obviously the key, the better for all of us. Hugh, and on that note, just some of the things which, and you've been very involved behind the scenes here, some of the guidelines that have been instrumental, please, in terms of, return to events in Western Australia, that again might provide some learnings for other people. One of the interesting things when we had last week's webinar, which brought together alliances from around the world, there were 9 people on that call saying that they were looking to create their own alliances, and obviously part of that is lobbying government. So the more we share this opportunity, it doesn't matter what country it is, if France is forming an alliance and they get back, or Croatia or Estonia or whatever. But what were some of the things that helped the Premier to make that decision to allow some of these events to come back?
I think the main take home is that the decisions were made based on localized information. And that's really important to highlight, that there is no one fit for everybody. Everything is going to be really different. And right from the get-go, if we compare, Australia has used 1.5 meters of physical distancing as a standard measure. We go to other countries. There are some countries that have used 1 meter. Now, therein lies a starting difference. The information around masks. So the question, I'll touch on it now from Eric, around masks at those events in Australia. No, masks won't be necessary. The crowds that we'll see in 3 weeks' time with 60,000 people will be without physical distancing. So the 1.5 meter rule will be dropped. Crowd density requirements that started at 1 1 person per 4 metres squared were recently reduced to 1 person per 2 metres squared. Those requirements will drop as well, and 60,000 people can sit within close proximity as they would any other day of a life pre-COVID. In that environment, masks are not necessary. Essentially, all measures have been lifted. What has allowed that to occur to a certain extent is an international border around Australia that has limited the amount of virus within Australia. It put it in a very fortunate position. And then within Australia, a number of the states have for a period of time had strict quarantine requirements at state border level as well. So to pass into Western Australia over the past couple of months has required compulsory quarantine in a hotel or facility for 2 weeks. So by keeping a very tight island within an island, the one benefit, of course, is while it didn't go up the curve very far, thankfully, it's also stopped it from going up. So it's now in a position very similar to New Zealand. We do know that COVID will re-emerge at some point. So there's no false hope at any stage here that COVID is not a risk. State borders will open. International borders are clearly a long way away for Australia because it's a key part of the national strategy. But what we have seen is an understanding that no matter what we do, COVID will turn up again. 5 days ago, the conversation that was happening in Melbourne was that measures would be getting lifted closer to what we're about to see in Western Australia. A couple of stages behind, but it was following the same trajectory. 5 days later, it's re-entering lockdown, and the concerns that are there now are more severe than they were 2 months ago. So it does shift really quickly, and nobody's under the illusion that by opening up with no cases and reopening borders that it's not going to emerge again. So what we do see out of all of this is a willingness from people to participate at a personal level. If you are coming up next to somebody and you're feeling unwell, the last thing you want to do is cough or sneeze over the person next to you or around you, because you can be sure that 50 people within earshot are probably going to try and kill you if they haven't run away, because there's a lot of concern about what it might be. The awareness clearly is that we need to be responsible for hygiene. And that's been a really big factor in being able to move forward. The other element here around localised decision-making, the government's been able to take the viewpoint, and it's been a success story for Western Australian jurisdiction, is that we were able to talk to the government and highlight that when you have a major event, when we're projecting the timelines that we're looking at, by the time we get to the point that you can put 20,000, 40,000, 60,000 people together, it takes time for that to all occur. And on the trajectory that it was happening, the state itself had no community transmission now for approximately 2 months. So there were some really favourable answers in there, but I would say to anybody involved in those discussions with any government around the world, you need to look at timeline, because it's very clear that when we're looking at 3-week intervals, that we start to see the effect of lifting measures. And time again, every government around the world has been very clear that lifting measures is watched for 2 to 3 weeks and then adjusted. And you peel back one layer at a time so that you feel more and more comfortable and you don't see any renewed rates of community transmission. So that's been a large part of the success story in Western Australia. It's certainly something if anyone wants to follow up on, I'm happy to discuss further around some of the details behind some of that decision-making process. It's clearly been a very positive one for this industry. And as a point I'll come back on to talk that Mike made that I'll talk to, that at this point in time, while we're so reliant on everybody doing something right, we need those case studies, and information sharing is so important. Be brave. Don't be afraid of putting your plans under somebody else's eyes. Get some fresh eyes to look at them. Someone is going to see something that you don't because you wrote it. Do not be afraid of somebody finding something that you didn't see. There's nobody in this industry in any role that has perfected their role, perfected their knowledge, has an answer to everything. because otherwise none of us would be having these conversations. It is hard enough already with the challenges in front of us. Don't be afraid to get somebody who can offer a set of eyes or a piece of expertise to have a look at it and start to ask you some of those questions. Because if you're not feeling comfortable around answering those questions to somebody one-on-one, you probably don't want to be in a position where you want to be putting that plan on the public stage where people will criticize you in the public arena. And that's something that I think we've seen a really positive response from the industry, that a lot of people are sharing information and asking questions. And it's something that, for the betterment of us all, as we move forward, I hope it's something we continue to see post this immediate phase.
That's a great point, and we raised it on the last call, didn't we, Mike? I mean, even a big established event like Chicago uses an external consultant to be, not necessarily because they know more, but to give an objective perspective of stuff that you don't see, that's right in front of your eyes. And maybe kind of in a similar situation, coming back to you there, Marcel, you made an interesting comment to me yesterday, and again reiterated it today, is this opportunity, and it has come up in a number of forums, this opportunity to start with a blank piece of paper almost. So, we kind of get caught up sometimes, but we've done it like this for years. And, the Bundesliga scenario, they went with 10 different plans. And we've spoken about that before, but encouraging people to say, let's not get fixated, let's not wear the blinkers of taking the plan that we've used for the last 10 years and trying to adjust this. Maybe the opportunity is just to completely say, if we were creating this event tomorrow, how would we do it from scratch rather than try and tweak what we've got? Do you want to maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yes, so that's basically the industry standard, the quality standard, or the aim is to always start with a blank piece of paper and don't say, we have it always done before. And I think all on this call, or hopefully in this audience, do this, but now we can put it to a test and see every change. Every time you start from scratch, it hurts, taking apart something that you love or that you're used to. But it's something that's absolutely necessary. So what we've done in terms of, let's stick with races to have like an interesting example, we turned courses upside down, like ran a different direction to test, is there a better outcome? We took waves apart, so like one big start or 50 waves, or even start them fast in the beginning and slow them down in the end, or put a minimum speed or a maximum speed to the whole thing, or do it with just 10% of the capacity, basically testing everything to look at everything. 90% of those plans never see the light of day, but all of those made us smarter for sure. They gave us a chance to do something that we didn't expect to do in 2020. In the beginning, maybe some had some time to try something, but now as we're progressing, we need to kind of look for answers, or at least find all the dead ends before we end up in them. And that really helped us basically run a race that we thought we would do just as much in 2019 and test it in 20 different outcomes. Just to see, is there maybe something? And if there's nothing for COVID, maybe there's something in it for post-COVID. And I heard this a couple of times in discussions that I was involved, that now, may it be museums we're working with or stadia, say, well, now we introduce something that we planned anyway. Maybe that's a new ticket system that gives you more information about the ticket, or maybe more freedom or more control than before. And maybe it's something you wanted to do anyway. So now you use this time when everybody looks for answers, or maybe you use this time that you have at hand where you're not in your own museum, and introduce something like this, which would have been a good idea anyway. You just didn't get around to this plan that you had maybe 3 years ago, but now's the right time to do that. And I heard that a couple of times, and very often the meeting is, it doesn't come to a conclusion. Even Hamburg is not at a conclusion, but it has some steps along the way that are absolutely worthwhile doing. And yeah, sharing, as Mike said, I mean, half of our meetings are find the hole or put the hole in the plan. And it always feels weird when you say, okay, cool, the purpose of this meeting is to destroy it, to destroy the plan. And so valuable, especially when you are able to like ask the one question where you said, yes, let's go back to that end and try the next one and try something entirely different. So this creativity, yeah, it's tiring, but it's something I haven't seen before in our event industry. They were like so fresh, and additionally to what we just said, basically have all eyes on Hamburg
Yeah.
at the moment to help them ask that one question that would make or break the event.
Mike, picking up on that, is there anything as an example of something that you've done in this process in Chicago where you've taken something that's been done for years and you've thrown it out and said, assuming that we get the green light and we can go ahead, we're going to do this in this way?
Are you saying in terms of like going through the risk assessment
Yeah,
process?
your operations to sort of say, okay, that blank piece of paper concept that MArcel said, we sat in a room, we had something that we'd done this way for all these years, and here's an example that might be useful to people listening to say that if Chicago can take something that's tried and tested and proved and re-engineer it and do something different, I mean, it's not public knowledge yet that you're starting at the finish and running back to the start. I'm joking, but yeah, is there anything particular that kind of stands out in this process?
Well, yeah, I think there's many things as I indicated or we talked about earlier, and MArcel has been part of this process as well. When you go through that risk assessment framework, and hopefully a lot of us event organizers and events are doing that to begin with, even before we did the COVID. But as you go through this exercise, specific to the COVID pandemic and, what's possible or not, you are learning a lot of new things, and whether it's from an operational aspect, communication standpoint, financial brand, etc. We're learning a lot, and it's not just one thing. There are multiple things. When you go and look under the microscope and you're looking for those gaps, you're really able to identify a lot of things, different types of processes that you need to focus on in the future, whether they're agreements, whether they're contracts with vendors, sponsors, etc., insurance. There's been a ton of learning, and it's not just going to get us and hopefully have an event in this specific year in our current condition, but beyond that, it'll make us a lot stronger. But and again, that's why, like you mentioned, working with an outside advisor to be able to help us identify, what we should be focused on has really helped us reveal that. So it's not just to get us through this pandemic, but it's a great investment in terms of how can that help us from an organization standpoint, from a company aspect, and be a lot more solid. One of the things that we've learned as well is it's great to be able to have this outside advisor and many outside advisors, whether it's MArcel, whether it's the Parachute Group and other experts in the field coming together, because by far they're so much smarter than I am, and I need as much help as I can get. But bringing them together to develop these plans, and then once you start to layer those plans on our existing emergency plans and all hazards plan, it's not just this plan that has to work; it has to be on top of other ones as well. So that example that I'm giving is like, and we were talking about this earlier with MArcel, these plans that we're working on for the current, pandemic or the COVID, everything we're talking about has to be perfect in order for this very hard plan to be effective, right? And then once you put it on top of our all hazards plan, what if we have to evacuate and shelter because of lightning, which is likely, and it's happened to us in the past few years where we've had to evacuate, we had to shelter due to storms. For a heat-related incident in Chicago, which everyone's aware of, we had to cancel halfway in 2007, 2008, similar condition, 2010, similar conditions. That potentially will happen. The likelihood is pretty high, and the impact is pretty severe. And once you start putting that on top of, COVID, now you're asking people to shelter in close confines and in areas that you're going to clump people together. So as much as you can spread people out in open areas, there might be a situation you're going to have to bring people back together. Then talk about a heat situation and transporting individuals, which we saw in 2007. And one of the main reasons we had to shut things down is we overwhelmed the health system, which is already overwhelmed. So what are some of the things that we're helping to mitigate that risk or threat, and making sure that that's been identified? And again, I think those are things that hopefully a lot of these event organizers are considering, not just to have the plan to have an event, but what are the other you know, risks that are out there that we've always been planning for? And that's what I'm hoping. It's like, and again, you want these plans. And one thing good about transparency is being able to see if they've been looking at these different areas and you know, the severity of the risk type, and that they've been planning for this, not just having a hand sanitizer station and they think they're all good, or requiring or asking people to wear a mask. Because again, that I don't feel that that's responsible, and they really took a lot of time. And again, that's what I'm just hoping, that everyone's done the hard work that I'm sure that Hamburg has done, and you can see that work. And that's what's great about transparency. You can see what goes into it. Other ones that aren't sharing, you would question and hope that they are just, and that's what you're saying. Hope that they've done that type of due diligence, looked under every rock and in every corner, to make sure that they're keeping their volunteers safe, their participants safe, their communities. And that's the other impact that you'll have, is the city in which you'll run, and some of the communities and neighborhoods that you're running through. And a lot of them probably won't be happy, you know, having all these runners and coming through without masks, if that's the case, and leaving debris all over the street, even though that, you know, there's so much to this. So again, and just hoping that they're layering their plans on top of the existing ones that's talking about emergency, because that's the other part. Once you start to look at that and the impact that you would have on different systems and bringing people, it looks all great if everyone followed the plan and the participants changed their behavior and stayed in line and they're moving along on a conveyor belt. But we know that that's just not the case.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Some great insights as always there. Folks, we're pretty much out of time. Let me just go to the couple of the chat boxes and see. Taylor, thanks for sharing that. Maintaining team morale in the face of absolutely uncertain timelines specific to our team. You guys have had it really tough, yeah. The political situation in Hong Kong, team spread all over the place and nothing happening for it. And I'm sure that echoes what many people are feeling. Dermot, agree, independent eyes look at your plans. Andrew Cook, Mike made a really good point that all our plans need to be integrated. With this will come with collaboration. This is always a great challenge for when we are planning and then delivering the event. The other key point is readiness and assurance, testing and training. Thank you, Andrew. MArcel, to Stuart, the big challenge is that Hamburg is basically starting with an emergency from the beginning, which has effects on additional reactions to the scenarios. Thank you, MArcel. Ben Williams, what financial measures and insurance would an event like Hamburg have in place to protect against a large COVID-related outbreak taking place right before the event is scheduled? Look, my guess is, right now we had the insurance panel a couple of weeks ago. The recording of that is on the MPW channel and on the Facebook page. The reality is there's probably nothing that they can do in this stage because now COVID's now pre-existing. You can't get that kind of pandemic cover. If they had it in their plan previously, again, I'm not an insurance expert, but it's possible that they would have cover. But the reality is that probably impossible to put that in place at this stage. They're taking a large commercial risk like anybody is. I'm seeing a few nods from the panelists on that as well. Folks, I'm just going to do a quick wrap up. I think we're a couple of minutes over. Apologies for that. I think one of the key points that keeps coming up time and time again, there's no one size fits all. It's localized. You need to work within your local environment, take all this valuable information you get, but it needs to be localized. A great point by Hugh. No matter what happens, COVID's going to turn up, in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, 5 weeks, a few months' time. We need to take that approach. We hope that it may not, but we can't assume that it's gone and going to disappear. The issue of kind of, Mike, I think, made the comment that this timeline of, or it was Hugh, peeling back the layer as things happen. Governments are going to open up, but that layer might be put back on again. So, from a commercial perspective, we need to be, making decisions that we're already, most of this industry, many of this industry on its knees struggling, but making sure you're not putting yourself under more pressure with this desire that we have to have an event this year. You may be exposing yourself to even more commercial risk than putting your hand up and saying, white flag for this year, we'll go forward next year. the whole thing around planning, the transparency of Hamburg, getting independent people to look at your plans, whether that be a consultant, a friend, someone outside, friend in the industry if you're a smaller business, but that third-party independence is so important. Start with a blank piece of paper. Yeah, I think that really great point that Mike made at the end there. This is, you have your COVID safe plan, but that doesn't mean that you don't have your protection against terrorism and your lightning attack and all those kind of things that are standard. It now needs to be really, really integrated into there. So thank you again to everyone that's tuned in. Thanks, Mike. Early start. I know you've got so much on your plate. I really appreciate you making the time 3 months in a row. Wish you all the best over the next few weeks. MArcel, also massively busy, and also Hugh. I know we've been trying to connect for the last week, and you've got so much on. So really appreciate all of you making the time. Those of you that tuned in, thanks very much. Go well. Look forward to seeing hopefully some of you next week with sponsorship. Go well, be safe, and take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.